Hello, everyone. Please go ahead and gather your food and take a seat. I'd like to get started. I'm Gary Seymour, Director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Welcome to our annual kickoff event. The theme for tonight are the many challenges and issues that the next U.S. president will face, whomever is elected in November. Obviously, top of the list is the continuing conflict in Gaza and the West Bank, and the risk that it could lead to a broader regional conflict, including Israel and Hezbollah, that might draw the United States into a military conflict in the region. On a closely related issue, the new administration will need to figure out how it wants to deal with the new government in Iran, whose president has talked about wanting to resume negotiations with the West over Iran's nuclear program. On top of all these difficult issues, there continues to be, in the Middle East, many issues related to migration and refugees, given the violence and instability in the region. So to guide us through this thicket of thorny issues, our moderator will be Professor Eva Bellin, who is the Myra and Robert Kraft Professor of Modern Arab Politics and Chair of the Politics Department here at Brandeis. On the panel, I especially want to welcome back to the Crown Center Ghaith al-Omari, who joins us from Washington. Ghaith is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he previously has served in a number of senior positions in the Palestinian Authority, including as director of the International Relations Department in the Office of the Palestinian President. Next, we have Michal Ben-Josef Hirsch, who's an associate in the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University and a former senior fellow at the Crown Center. She has written extensively on Israeli domestic politics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hadi Kahalzadeh is currently a junior research fellow at the Crown Center. He has a PhD in social policy from the Heller School here at Brandeis, and he's conducted research and written about the effect of economic sanctions on Iran. And finally, we welcome Nihal Kayali, who's a junior research fellow at the Crown Center. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her research and writing focuses on Syrian refugees in Turkey. So with that, I will turn things over to Eva Bellin, who will run our session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. I have to say I'm really honored to be in conversation with such well-informed colleagues about contemporary politics in the Middle East. I also want to point out that the Crown Center will be holding an event that will be solely focused on the war in Gaza in about 3 weeks. I think it's Tuesday, October 8th. Yeah. And we're going to have a terrific panel of scholars to discuss the war. We have Shai Feldman, our professor in the politics department, and Abdulmonem Said Ali from Egypt, and Khalil Shikaki, a pollster from the West Bank. And they will be exclusively focused on the causes, the conduct, and the consequences of the war in Gaza. So we will be touching on that this evening, but that is not necessarily the primary focus. Of course, when you come up at the end and you want to raise questions, you can raise whatever you choose. But I just want you to know we have a dedicated evening to just discuss that issue coming up soon. So today we're going to be focusing on a host of other issues, including de-democratization in Israel, political crises and challenges in Iran, the migrant crisis, the Syrian migrant crisis in Turkey, and the upcoming presidential elections, and how Middle East politics are going to play out for the elections, and how the elections will play out for Middle East politics. And of course, if there are issues that we have not discussed that you want to raise, we will have a Q&A session at the end, and you're welcome to raise whatever you choose. So I'm going to start the conversation with the case of Israel. And I'm happy to be in conversation with Michal Ben-Josef Hirsch. And I want to start by referencing an excellent brief that Michal wrote about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, on democratic backsliding in Israel over the past decade. You know, we have seen some serious erosion in the quality of democracy in recent years in Israel. And I thought we'd start by maybe you can give some keynote examples of policies that the Israeli government has undertaken that have really defined this trend towards democratic erosion in the last few years.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. So in the year preceding the October 7th, I refer to this as a marker, most of the attention was on really the judicial reforms that was attempted. However, the democratic backsliding of Israel, we actually started way before that. We're going on a decade at least before, or definitely several years. And in democratic backsliding literature, when we study that in other countries such as Hungary, even in the United States, the tendency is to look at three levels of analysis. You look at the leadership, you look at the institutions and policies, and you look at the values and the faith that people have in the democracy. So I actually think that the leadership is the least interesting one. That's Netanyahu is actually the least interesting one. Yes, he echoes a lot of populist traits that we see in other leaders around the world. But I think the institutional change in Israel and the value and normative change is probably more significant in this case. And by institutional, I mean the strains of illiberal legislation that we have seen leading up to the override clause and the judicial reforms. And we can go as far as 2011, the so-called Nakba law, which was a direct attempt to forbid the commemoration of anything which is the commemoration of the Nakba in Israel, but basically anyone who is kind of referred to the establishment of the state of Israel as a day of mourning was basically was going to face budgetary penalties. And then we can go, there was the other laws. I think probably the most significant one is actually in 2018. It's the nation-state law, which basically defined the state of Israel as the state of the Jewish people, which is not surprising. That's not the surprising part of it. The more surprising part of it is basically the preferential allocation of land, which was defined in the law. And again, it's not surprising. There was preferential allocation of land to Jewish people in Israel for history, but that made it a basic law. So basically, basic laws have the status of a constitution in Israel because Israel doesn't have a constitution. So and another thing is the absence of the clause of equality, which was not included in the law. So the law is interesting for what it includes and for what it does not include. So again, so this all happened before the judicial reform attempts, which kind of ultimately tried to give more power to the Knesset to override all the other basic laws in Israel.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering whether you think, if we bring in the Gaza war, do you think the Gaza war has affected this process of democratic backsliding, either for the good or the bad? I mean, some might say the Gaza war put an end to the whole judicial conflict. It just stopped it. So that's good for democracy, but what do you think in general?
So it definitely it somewhat put a stop for that, even though there are attempts to revive it actually now.
Yeah.
Just started about a month ago again. And I think in the short term, there were like modest short-term expectation immediately after October 7 that maybe that will bring people together, but it will kind of create a more cooperative. I actually don't think that happened. I think if we go to the three levels of analysis, leadership, institutions, and I think in this way the most concerning the values, it actually strengthened the democratic backsliding of Israel. In terms of leadership, so we have the populist rhetoric kind of amplified. In terms of legislation, we do have more laws that limit, especially the freedom of the press, the so-called Al Jazeera law, which limits the freedom of the press to do, and we have a proposal which is still in the High Court to dismiss academic professors if they incite for terrorism. So these are clear limitations on a freedom of speech, which the main problem is the chilling effect that they have, because you find in surveys that people, especially, for example, Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel, hesitate to express any opinions that divert from that. The other institutional thing is the power of the police and their role in demonstrations in Israel, which has been quite extensive. The Minister Ben-Gvir, the Minister of National Security, is trying to gain direct control over the police, which means a less independent institution, which is a measure for less democracy. But finally, is the illiberal sentiment of the Israeli people, I mean Jewish Israeli people. It's expected. It's a war. You expect that there will be a rise in illiberal sentiments all over the world. It's something which is characteristics of all wars around the world. And the Israelis in general are united around the wars and the causes of the wars. There's very little dissent. However, we do see also values which are like 2/3 of the Israelis oppose humanitarian aids to Gaza, any humanitarian aids to Gaza. In surveys, Israelis support civilian casualties, not restricted between civilian casualties. They support siege on Gaza. So basically, there is quite a significant radicalization of illiberal sentiments, as we can observe that.
And you think that will survive the war? Because at wartime, people are crazy.
Yes, so in wartime, people are crazy. And at the beginning of the war, when Israelis, at least by their own account, defined it as existential threat, they perceived the Hamas attack as an existential threat, and then later all the threats of Hezbollah and Iran as existential threat. However, we're 11 months into, the existential threat has subsided. We still have the regional war looming, but we actually see very little change in surveys with regard to what we would measure as liberal values.
Got it. So my final question to Michal has to do with American elections and whether you think, right now, Trump and Harris are 50-50. I mean, nobody knows who's going to win. Do you think it would make a difference? Who wins the elections for the Gaza war and for Israel and for Palestinians, or it really doesn't?
The short answer is no.
Doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, but I will say it a little bit differently. So if we look historically, American foreign policy with regard to Israel, it made very little difference if the president was Republican or Democrat across history. If we look, we have nuances and we have differences, but we have strong bipartisanship commitment to the security of the State of Israel. It's expressed repeatedly by both candidates. So, and I think in terms of interest, they both have joint interests, is to prevent escalation to a regional war. They're not different, I think, in this sense. They maybe have different style of expressing that, but they both would like to prevent a regional war. So I think it might be difference in the nuances. There might be a little bit of actually the period of maybe between administration could be used as a little bit window for the nuances. For example, we have precedents that Bush was elected after Reagan. In the window, it was actually when the American administration started to talk with the PLO in 1988. So we have that window. And in the window between Obama and Trump, that was the first time the United States did not veto a UN resolution against the settlements. So actually the period between the administration could be something for creativity, regardless of who's the next president, but overall I think that we're going to see very little variation, whoever is the president.
Got it. Okay, thank you, Michal. So now let's turn to my colleague Ghaith al-Omari. He is an expert on Palestinian politics. And now I am going to focus on the war in Gaza. And I'll ask you to address that last question, but last. Okay? Because I think it's better to start with just talking about the horror of this war. And what you think, what are the most important things that Americans need to know about the war now and the situation in Gaza today?
Wow, how many hours do I have?
Yeah, not much time.
Look, I mean, first of all, on a personal note, I mean, thank you, Gary. And it's really a pleasure to be back at the Crown Center. I think one of maybe the first university appearance I made when I came to the US was here. Shai invited me, and it really feels like home. So it's really a pleasure. Look, I mean, I'm going to focus primarily on policy issues. But it is important, I think, to focus, to start at this, acknowledge that this is a war that is having a huge human toll that is tragic, unspeakable. And we need to acknowledge it. And we need to acknowledge that ultimately policy has to be rooted in a human perspective. And as kind of subset of this, I think the first thing that Americans, we need to focus on is the question of empathy. I think it's very easy for each side to basically just look at their people we are affiliated with and feel that we have a monopoly on suffering. And frankly, there's plenty of that. The reality is everyone is suffering. Whether you talk about the horrors of October 7th, the terror attack and its implications, you talk about the hostages and their families, etc., or you talk about what's happening in Gaza to Palestinian civilians, etc. This is, to my mind, important both on a human level and on an ethical level. But also we have to remember the war is going to be over. The Palestinians are going to be there to stay. The Israelis are going to be there to stay. And we have to find a path outside of that. What it is right now, I have no clue. But ultimately, we should not do things now which make life easier for us. Harder for us after the war to find a path forward. Now, to go more to the kind of policy side of things, I believe the first thing that we need to understand in this country, which I just don't see, at least in the public debate, is the complexity of this war. This is not a clear kind of morality play. Just to give you a flavor of that, I think after a terror attack like October 7th, every country has every right to defend itself. I think Israel had every right to go and try to basically ensure Hamas can never do that. That's what we did after 9/11. That's what the Egyptians did after ISIS killed some of those folks. That's what the Jordanians did when the ISIS burned one of their pilots, etc. That's normal. Yet at the same time, just because it's a just war, it doesn't mean that the means are just. And what we see right now, the conduct of the war, we see many excesses. Clearly, violations of the rules of war, which are very obvious. So is it just war? Is it not just war? I don't know. It's a complex war in which one has to look at all of these aspects. Another one, we talk about the story of the day, the issue of a ceasefire agreement. And I see the parties involved in what we call in diplomacy, dead cat diplomacy, shifting the blame. Everyone wants to show that the other side is to blame. And unfortunately, we also echo that in a lot of our conversations here. The reality is both sides, for their own purposes, feel that time is on their side, and they have no interest in reaching that. Sinwar of Gaza looks at the possibility of the West Bank blowing up, looks at the northern front with Lebanon, and yes, that's cooled off a little bit. That story is not over yet. We're waiting for Iran. So why should he wait? He looks at the demonstrations in Israel. From his perspective, why is he in a hurry? Bibi is in no hurry either, for his own political reasons, but also for military reasons. He feels that the military pressure on Hamas is working. So again, we are quick to kind of assign blame. The reality is that this is happening in a very complex environment. The other thing that I think is very important for us, at least in the policy world, to start thinking about more seriously is the exit strategy. It's very easy to start wars. I mean, we do it all the time. But starting a war is much easier than ending a war. Think Afghanistan, think Iraq. We're still there right now. Now the Israelis are in Gaza. How is the war is going to end at some point, and then what's next? How can the Israelis exit the war? What policy choices they have to make to enable them to exit Gaza, and what policy choices should the Palestinians make to be able to come and basically give Israel the assurances that it needs, and ultimately, what role do you want the region to play? And this kind of, magical thinking that the region is going to come and somehow take over Gaza and, obviate any obligations on Israel or Palestinians, dream on. Yet there has to be a role for the region to play. And finally, I would say, we all talk about the need to prevent a regional war. The reality is we are in a regional war right now. If you look around the Middle East, I don't remember a time when there are so many open fronts happening at the same time in the Middle East. Look at the Red Sea navigation right now has been more or less crippled. Obviously, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, we talk about preventing a war. The reality, every day there's an exchange of fire and there are casualties. The West Bank, you have casualties of the same magnitude of the Second Intifada, and we're starting to see a resurgence of the kind of terror inside Israel itself. For heaven's sake, the Jordanians are bombing Syria. The Iranians are trying to infiltrate Jordan. So we do have a regional war, and if we don't start looking at the region in a holistic way, and how do we approach the region, not in a kind of piecemeal way, then I suspect that we are missing a major piece.
So, Ghaith, do you think a great power like the United States really has a role to play? Or is this something the people in the region have to figure out on their own?
Of course it has a role to play. Without the US, every time the US exits the scene, we have a mess. And to be honest, let me maybe zoom out a little bit and say, and I'm not going to say, I'm not going to echo Trump and say if he was president, there'll be October 7th. But the reality is, this administration, by the way, because that's a silly thing to say, the reality is this administration came and almost as a dogmatic article of faith, decided we're going to deprioritize the Middle East. So what did we do? What does deprioritizing mean? You reduce staffing, you reduce resources, you reduce attention. I remember right after October 7th, I was invited to give a briefing to some intelligence community, and friends of mine who I knew worked on the Middle East were telling me, we have been reassigned for the last 2 years to do China, etc. Now we need to come up to speed. We were not there, a mess happened. So obviously we need to play a role. Because we were not there, because we were caught on guard, as a reality, we have been so far only reactive. What is our policy right now vis-a-vis the conflict? Our policy is basically react to the issue of the day, ceasefire, etc., without trying to shape the environment. Even our regional policy has been reactive. The crown jewel of the administration's Middle East policy now is the Israel-Saudi thing. This is not something that we shaped. This is something that's happening in the region, and we came late to the game. So I think it is important. The U.S. has an important role. Now, what would I want the U.S. to do? And I doubt we'll be able to do it during this administration. Just there's no time left, is a number of things. First of all, what I ended up my last question with is we have to figure out the exit strategy, and we have to lean on the different actors to play their role. Again, to give you an example, the Saudis want a lot of goodies from us in a defense treaty, nuclear, that kind of stuff. Well, they have to pay a price, and maybe the price should be an engagement in rebuilding the Palestinian Authority, reforming the Palestinian Authority, and an engagement in rebuilding Gaza. We have to, but it's something that only we can do, and things along these lines. And finally, I would say, again, what I ended up with last question, which is we need a regional strategy. At the end of the day, these different issues are linked. And the most obvious link is Iran, obviously, with all of its proxies. But there are other links, intra-Arab tensions, shifts in the center of gravity in the Arab world from the Levant and Egypt into the Gulf, and how we factor this into this. So, and this requires, obviously, the next administration to have the right kind of high-level focus that we on this region. Otherwise, the region will just run away. We cannot do everything, but we can definitely shape the environment. We can definitely shape the priorities and add cost and benefit to those who want to play along or not play along.
So if I can bring the elections into this, and I know there's a limit to what you're permitted to talk about politically, but do you think it makes a difference? Who wins? Harris, Trump?
Actually, I mean, putting aside the limitation of what I can say because I'm at 501c3 and we can't do politics, but I actually would say we just don't know. At this moment, we just don't know. Anything that a candidate says right now is political, purely political. This is not policy. I mean, we call it the silly season for a reason. Right now, what you hear from the candidates relates to what they think resonates with whatever constituency they want to deal with. I think we will only know what difference will happen after the elections once we have a better sense of what are the foreign policy teams that each candidate will bring. You know, I can imagine two very different Harris administrations. I can see a Harris administration that's a continuation of this administration whereby you deprioritize the Middle East and hope, just try to end this war and hope that it doesn't bother us for the next 4 years. Or you can see a Harris administration that will appoint someone high level dealing with this, maybe a Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, envoy, etc. These are things we will only know once we see who's in place. And the same with Trump, by the way. I can imagine Trump the isolationist appointing a Secretary of State and National Security team that is all about how do we exit the world. And the Middle East is going to be part of it, as well as NATO, as well as the Pacific, etc. But I can also see someone like, if you bring someone like Pompeo, for example, who, think of what you will of his policies, was not an isolationist. These are two very different approaches. So until, this may be too much in the kind of nuance, but I think this is the kind of nuance that will determine what the next administration, and that's right now a question that simply is unanswerable because I believe neither campaign has time or priority to deal with the question of who's their national security team.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you. Okay, well, let's now turn to my colleague, Hadi Kahalzadeh. And Hadi is an expert in Iranian political economy and politics in general. And Hadi wrote a very interesting policy brief on Iranian politics. And in that brief, you referenced that Iran faces four major crises, right? As I recall, you said an economic crisis, a trust crisis, government capacity crisis, and an international crisis. So I thought maybe we just start, you can explain to the audience what those four crises are.
Thank you, Professor Bellin. Yeah, I believe we can categorize Iran crisis in these four major areas. And for example, the economy crisis that we have, I believe since 2009, Iran's economy lost its capability to generate enough wealth. So when we look at the economy growth rate, we see with the JCPOA, Iran's economic growth rate is 1%, without that is -1. So such a low, such a stagflation or low growth cause a lot of problems. For example, every year the government faced with the huge budget deficit, like between 20 to 30% budget deficit, and the government has to push or adopt a very aggressive tax policy and impose a lot of pressure on private sector. At the same time, try to borrowing money from the central bank, and the borrowing money from the central bank has to print the money, and it means that a higher inflation. When we look at for almost 3 decades, Iran's inflation rate was around the 20%, and right now, after 2018, we shifted to 40%. And when we look at that, higher inflation means more poverty, and the poverty, based on my estimation in Iran, in 2009 was around 20%, and right now 40% of Iranians can be considered as a poor, or 65% are poor or at risk of poverty. So because of the lack of investment in infrastructure, like in energy, and every year, because of the lack of shortage of natural gas in winter or electricity in summer, economies shut down. The banking system is failed, and the pension fund crisis is huge, and so we should forget about the Greece. I mean, Iran is a very specific case. But this caused a lot of dissatisfaction. So based on according to the recent survey, Iran has a attitude survey that 92% of Iranians expressed that they're satisfied with the situation. This, the last one before this survey, 2015, 20% of Iranians said that they have no, they think that the situation will get worse within the next 5 years. This year, in 2024, 55% so believe that the condition would be get worse in the next 5 years. In 2015, 20% of Iranians said they have no confidence in the government, and this time 60% said that they have no confidence. So that's why in the recent election, in the first round, presidential election, the first round 60%, and the second round 50% of Iranians didn't take a part, and Pezeshkian won the election with the lowest turnout after the revolution. So, and we have sanctions that Iran, after Russia, is the second sanctioned nation in the world. But I believe the most challenging issue is that the government, the state, lost its capability to solve the problems, and governable actually cannot generate or design good policies or implement it. That is beyond the mismanagement. Is the lowest capacity situation after the revolution. But when you look at these four major challenges in the broader context of supreme leader succession, that makes a significant. We can see how significant it is, and so because these four issues are growing rapidly and deeply intertwined with each other. But the problem is the supreme leader is 86 years old, so no one when maybe tomorrow or next 10 years, and so we will have the next supreme leader. So in this context, it makes a lot of it makes show the significance of the crisis.
Right. Though maybe it doesn't create any opening for optimism, like with a change in the supreme leader, we might move in a different direction.
No one knows. No, I'm not optimistic.
No. So what impact do these four crises have on Iran's international position? I mean, do you think that makes Iran more aggressive or less aggressive when it comes to, its attitude toward nuclear deterrence or, fostering trouble among its allies in Iraq and Lebanon? I mean, do you think it calms them or it makes them more aggressive?
I believe it makes them more aggressive because traditionally, there have been two schools of thought in Iran's foreign policies, and both adhering to motto of neither East nor West, but one advocate for normalizing relation with the West, in particular US, the other fraction opposite it. But maximum pressure, I believe, was a turning point. Before that, reformist or moderator advocated for solving the problems of the sanctions. For example, Rouhani won the election because he actually advocated for the diplomacy and engagement, and working on normalizing the relationship with the West and working with the neighbors. But the other side advocating for some sort of regional deterrence. But after maximum pressure, they actually said that we told you that United States is not a reliable partner, and US would never, actually live up with its commitment. So instead of buying 100 Boeings, for example, from United States, Mr. Rouhani, you should expand the relationship with China. So the other side, actually hardliner or conservative, advocating for a regional deterrence without nuclear deterrence, and second, building a resistance economy that including working with China and Russia. And after October 7th, right now, for example, they advocate for, building again a resistant economy plus a regional deterrence. And we hear something in the campaign that we have to, in this actually fraction in the group, that some some advocacy for including nuclear deterrence in the, and resistant camp. But Mr. Pezeshkian is not, unlike Rouhani, is not very optimistic, but he tried to actually continue for de-escalation with the neighbors.
Yes.
And also hoping for negotiation and working with, but Mr. Arakchian said that last week that it seems that they actually just moved from the optimistic for negotiation toward that we have to mitigate the impact of sanction, working with the China and Russia, and working with the other neighbors. So from these two actually school of thought, we witnessed some sort of shift toward, like, in a state of normalizing relationship with the United States, say that we should go after mitigating the actually impact of sanctions. And hardliner, and say they said as a last sentence, they said that we made a deal with the U.S. in JCPOA that President Trump withdrew it, and recently we actually made a deal with the President Biden for prisoner exchange. And so, and the U.S., we released the prisoners, and the United States accepted and agreed to release $6 billion Iran asset from South Korea to Qatar, and for humanitarian purposes. And after several months, they said, no, I'm sorry, you can't touch it, and refroze it again. So how we can work with this government? And that's why it's not like we have it. I can say that a growing or disputing around whether we should work on, mitigate the cost of sanction, damage of sanction, or we should include the, nuclear deterrence in other regional deterrence.
So it is interesting. We have seen some restraint on the part of Iran in the last month or two, right? I mean, that surprised me, at least, that they have not been more aggressive. And should we attribute that to the new president, who's a more moderate guy, or any thoughts on that? On that restraint, does that make you at all optimistic?
Because of the size of the problem that we have in Iran, the four major challenges I mentioned, and the U.S. policy actually over the last 5-6 years, I'm not very optimistic that the position can solve the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Last question, and that has to do with the elections. So, do you think it makes a difference for Iran who wins the election, Trump or Harris?
I'm not a specialist in the field, but I can say no. I don't believe that it makes a significant difference in the situation because of two reasons. First is Iran is not the first priority of the United States. The first priority is normalizing the relationship between Saudi and Israel and isolating Iran. The second is the Iran-US policy, and particularly sanction and maximum pressure, is based on the two, I believe, wrong assumptions. The first, that sanction would eventually work, means that the foreign economy pressure can transfer or generate very powerful political domestic pressure in Iran, as Mr. Pompeo or Bolton, believe that the sanction eventually, force Iranian to rise up against the regime, or even, sanction could, control or limit the, Iran nuclear advancement. That it didn't work. And definitely, Gary can explain what's happened after, in terms of the Iran nuclear advancement during the maximum pressure. The second wrong assumption is that the sanction has no cost for the United States. So it's easy. We call someone in OFAC office and select someone because Iran, we have no trade with Iran. The size of Iran's economy is very small, so has no cost. So the easy way to show that we can punish Iran is imposing sanction. But I'm not talking about long-term impact of overusing the sanction. That we know that someone mentioned that overusing sanction, force or many, not China or Russia, many U.S. allies to think about the alternative path of doing business, regardless of that issue and regardless of the nuclear advancement during the maximum pressure. Sanction pushed Iran toward China and Russia. Look at what happened right now for transferring Iran arms to Russia for the Ukraine war. Look at the region like for Aramco, what's happened after 2019, and Red Sea, like right now, Houthis. I don't know how many attacks was on U.S. bases in the region over the last 4 or 5 years. Someone said is above 1,000 attack on U.S. And right now the Red Sea, Houthi attack on Red Sea, someone says that is cost $1 billion every year, and every day between $2 to $4 million for United States. So Iranians try to say that you cannot isolating us and find a way to impose some cost to United States. So I don't believe that these two wrong assumption or the first, as long as the priority of the United States not change, I'm not optimistic for any change in the situation.
Okay. All right, now let me turn to my colleague Nihal Kayali, and she is an expert on the Syrian refugee crisis in Turkey. So I thought maybe we'd just start by helping our audience understand, getting a sense of the scope of this crisis. Like, how many people are we talking about? What are the conditions of life? What is going on with Syrian refugees in Turkey today?
Yeah, so Turkey hosts the largest kind of refugee population in the world. Of that, 3 million, over 3 million, are registered Syrian refugees. There are also a lot of Syrians who are unregistered, so that means well over 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. And when we think about the Syrian refugee crisis, a lot of us think back to 2015, 2016, when it was the story in the global media. Syrians had actually been coming to Turkey since 2011, when the kind of uprisings in Syria had started and quickly devolved into kind of protracted conflict. But it came to the global stage in around 2015, 2016, once these Syrians were seeking shelter on European soil in very large numbers. And we were seeing all the videos of the kind of the dinghies in the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. But then Turkey negotiated a deal with the European Union that essentially the EU pays Turkey to be a holding ground for Syrian refugees. And after that happened, we started hearing less about Syrian refugees. All of those Syrian refugees, or at least most of them, are still in Turkey, and they're trying to live their daily lives there. And so, now it's been 7, 8, 9 years. The situation is not great for Syrian refugees in Turkey. And I'll kind of focus on two strands of difficulty for Syrian refugees. The first is that a lot of the Syrian refugees in Turkey live in the border regions. So these are provinces like Hatay, Antep, Urfa, that are just north of the Syrian border. And as we all know, that area was hit by a really catastrophic earthquake in February of 2023. And so there is a huge, millions of Syrian refugees have kind of dealt with a humanitarian crisis within a humanitarian crisis. They were already very vulnerable, already barely getting by, and then their homes were destroyed, and so now there's this kind of increased kind of difficulty for these populations, a lot of internal migration to other cities. And I should note that northern Syria, northwestern Syria is even more of a mess, and those refugees get a fraction of the humanitarian aid that the ones in Turkey are getting, because the state did at least have some humanitarian response. But perhaps the more kind of politically salient issue is that the economy in Turkey has been experiencing quite a downturn recently. There's a cost of living crisis, huge rampant inflation. Everyone is suffering, and Syrians have become the scapegoat for a lot of societal ills in Turkey. And this has meant that for Syrians all around the country, they experience day-to-day xenophobia. There is increased policing of their movements throughout any sort of public space. There is an increase in intercommunal violence, and there has kind of been a huge increase in deportations, which are being framed by the government as voluntary repatriations. And so Syrians are having a lot of trouble just getting by, going to school, going to work. The amount of kind of vitriol that this population faces is really kind of unprecedented, even though this has been increasing since about 2017 or so. And I have Syrian friends who are doing quite well for themselves, middle class, and they're saying, we can't stand this anymore, we need to get out of here. And these are people who are maybe a little better off. So I think everyone is really struggling.
Wow. So when we talked about this a little bit, you mentioned something called the legal architecture of refugee reception in Turkey. I don't know what that term means. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, what the largest significance of that is.
Yeah, sure. So I think the kind of legal status that Turkey has endowed Syrian refugees with really matters for the way that the politics have unfolded over the past now 10 years. So it started in 2011 with an open door policy to Syrian refugees. And this was a part of President Erdogan's broader vision of being this kind of beacon of, like the Sunni Muslim kind of arbiter of what goes on in the region, kind of in the image of his Ottoman predecessors, right? And so he immediately kind of threw his support behind the opposition, banking on the quick fall and ouster of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And so he was really helping to support these Sunni Muslim opposition parties. And part and parcel to that policy was allowing Sunni Muslim Syrians, I should note that not all Syrians are Sunni Muslim, but he frames it as such that Turkey is kind of this humanitarian host for these Sunni Muslims fleeing a dictator. He takes this posture early on. The numbers continue to increase, and by 2014, Turkey really needs like a policy that can, at least an institutionalized policy to manage these refugee flows. And what they do is that they implement a temporary protection regulation. And this law is quite generous in that it provides short-term social rights being things like access to healthcare, free access to healthcare, which we don't have for citizens here, so quite generous. Access to education, theoretically access to legal work. And so there's this kind of very humanitarian move to provide millions of refugees with legal status. The long-term implications, unclear, right? Because it's a temporary status. It's not refugee status. So Syrians in Turkey are not like capital R refugees. They're not protected under international law in the way that refugees are. So what this has meant is that Turkey kind of became this global beacon of humanitarianism, while other countries in the region were kind of reneging on those responsibilities to care for, protect refugees. And it was able to use that as political leverage to kind of get what it wanted from its regional neighbors. And so, they were able to get EU money to care for these refugees, allegedly. And then it kind of built up his humanitarian accolades. And so everyone seemed very grateful to Erdogan for this. But it really just allowed him to kind of posture in a broader geopolitical context as a great ruler while he just kind of pursued his personal political agendas. And I should note that very soon after this protection law was put in place, he already started cracking down, squeezing these protections. He securitized the border immediately. A lot of different kind of pressures were put on Syrian refugees immediately after he was able to kind of negotiate these deals. So very much a political maneuver, a tactical maneuver that worked out well for him. And I also do want to note, maybe beyond the context of Middle East politics, that after Turkey implemented temporary protection, it has become the dominant legal architecture, legal structure for forced migrant reception in the world. So I think Iran uses it for Afghans, Colombia uses it for Venezuelans, the EU uses it for Ukrainians, and the US has always used it on a smaller scale for forced migrants. And so I think the Turkish case is at least instructive on how this can be both a very kind of valuable humanitarian tool, but because it's short term, it can be manipulated to fit domestic political projects in a way that official refugee status cannot. And so it's something to be wary of as this policy, this way of dealing with forced migrants becomes really universal.
Got it. So let me just ask you a little bit more about domestic politics and how that came into play, because I think of Erdogan as one of these classic authoritarian guys leading democratic backsliding in his country and playing on xenophobia as one of his tropes. And yet in the beginning, as you say, he did present himself as, I am the generator of hospitality. It's part of a larger Muslim Sunni tradition. I'm embracing people. Now he doesn't seem to be talking about hospitality so much anymore. And I'm just curious what happened domestically. How have domestic politics changed his approach to the refugees? Is he embracing the kind of xenophobia that we see in Hungary or Germany, for example?
Yeah, so in many ways, Erdogan is your quintessential populist, right? He structured his entire kind of political project around representing the Sunni Muslim masses against a kind of disconnected secular elite, right? This has been for now, 20 years, how he has structured the politics. An interesting puzzle within the Turkish context, at least early on, in that kind of framework of hospitality that you mentioned, is that Erdogan was quite friendly towards refugees, and typically in these classical right-of-center populist mobilizations, xenophobia, anti-immigration is kind of the centerpiece of these projects, right? It wasn't for Erdogan at the beginning. And what's interesting, and what a lot of sociologists are looking at now, is how the center-left actually is a little bit more, it grasps more explicitly onto those tropes of xenophobia and anti-immigration than the center-right did or does explicitly. I think it does much more implicitly now. So you have a center-left that's quite anti-immigrant, and then you also have your far-right, kind of exuberantly anti-immigrant nationalist parties, which I would say are fringe, but are becoming a little bit less fringe. But I think with this kind of worsening economy, this cost of living crisis, every political party now is using anti-immigrant rhetoric in some way, shape, or form to further their political agendas. And I think everyone has been emboldened to crack down on refugees and use them as scapegoats. The AKP has actually been doing this since as early as, I would say, 2016, 2017. Soon after that like flagship EU deal, the border was closed, and then a lot of provinces in Turkey stopped registering Syrians. Like Istanbul stopped in 2018. Neighborhoods started putting quotas on how many immigrants could settle, or how many foreigners with residence permits could settle, to like 25% of a neighborhood. And then these deportations started and have just started spiraling out of control, I think, and there are not good numbers on how many people are being deported. So these open doors have gradually closed. The ruling party has absolutely also tapped into this anti-immigrant sentiment. They don't do it as explicitly as the ultra-nationalist far right, but they're certainly doing it. And so, there is really no central party that is pro-immigrant at this point. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So lots of ideas here, and now why don't we devote some time to Q&A. And we have some questions from outside, but I thought we'd start with students or faculty who are here. If people want to pose any particular question, please come forward. And if not, we'll just take the questions we've received from the stratosphere. Anybody want to pose a question? Please just identify yourself.
Okay, my name is Jordan Medved, and I want to ask if Harris would re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, if you believe that she will do that.
I have no idea, to be honest with you. So, but it seems that,
Yeah, maybe Gary wants to speak to that.
I mean, I think the more interesting question is whether Iran
Stand up,
would
Gary.
re-enter the deal. I don't think it would. I think Iran is very satisfied that it's made so much progress in its nuclear program since Trump withdrew from the agreement. And I don't think, my view is that Iran is not prepared to give up those nuclear assets, which it sees as important bargaining chips and potentially the pathway to making nuclear weapons.
Just add just say the narrative of the Islamic Republic, that I'm not supporting them. Just recently the Iran Supreme Leader said that we are welcome to continue negotiation, but we are not trusting that we have no trust in the U.S. So, but Iran's president is hoping that can continue negotiation. And but the problem, as Professor Seymour mentioned, that Iran's advancement is too much, and I don't know how they can back to that JCPOA commitment. And I don't know what's happened for sunset in October 25. That I don't know how is like whether United Kingdom or they would revoke Resolution 1929 or revoke the snapback. So there are a lot of issues. I don't know whether the new administration, if want to change the policy, have a time for do it in for October 25.
Maybe just a word in terms of how maybe the Arab world might react to some of these developments, because you're going to start seeing, and you're already seeing actually two different sets of approaches. One is the Arab world is going nuclear. You talk to the Saudis today, and they will tell you very bluntly, wait a minute, we're playing by the rules, and you're now arguing with us, can we have full enrichment, etc., while the Iranians are not playing by the rules? Well, guess what? The Pakistanis, we bankrolled their bomb, and hey, there's a couple there for us. So you're starting to see murmurs of this. So we're not quite there yet, but you'll start seeing the next president having to deal with this issue coming his or her way. And the second one, which has always been the issue for many of the Arab neighbors, is, wait a minute, what about the other problem that Iran poses, which is the proxies, the regional destabilization, etc. And this will become more difficult as Gary said, Iran becomes more of a threshold state. How do you do deterrence vis-a-vis that? And expect to see, again, some, shall we say, combination of containment, but also some adventurism in the way that some Arab countries will be dealing with this. So that's another thing that the next president will actually have to deal with.
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Hello. I was wondering, in regards to ceasefire talks and other diplomatic occurrences happening in the Middle East, beyond council appointments, what role the president plays personally there, and what we can expect to see depending on who ends up in office with Biden's exit.
So maybe to get informed of this question, we can see what the American people want. And what we have is recent surveys. When you ask Americans about their priorities from the president, so I believe in one survey, the war in Israel-Palestine was ranked number 13. In another survey, it was ranked number 10. So if candidates are listening to their constituencies, they want to do as little as possible in this sense. Even in what we call swing states, if you look at Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, over there too, it's very clear pictures that Americans don't want U.S. involvement in the Middle East. They oppose the entering any war between Israel and Iran. And they favor conditioning aid to Israel or not supporting sending aid. So if it is as much that Americans candidates are listening to their constituencies, at least now they want to say as little as possible and do as little as possible. I did say that I do think there might be an openings, a little bit of change between actually after the election and until the president becomes inaugurated. But the one thing we need to understand, the one thing that could change is the long term, actually, more in the short term, less in the short term than in the long term. This maybe we will see a little bit of change, because we cannot ignore the fact that the Democratic constituencies change.
Yes.
They do change. And they send a clear message to Harris, which is at the moment is in a position, I think she doesn't have to really. But as we move forward, and when I say long term, actually 2-3 years, it seems like the democratic constituencies would want to see more. And that's if I say. But I think this is a long-term issue for us, not a short-term.
So, go ahead, Ghaith.
I want to look at it maybe from less political, more foreign policy, the use of foreign policy, because often the use of foreign policy tools, except in very kind of highly emotive cases, tends to be driven less by politics and more by kind of geostrategic interest. But the first thing I would say to your question is look, one problem we've seen with this administration is, we say jokingly that the president has become the desk officer for Palestine, Israel. So the first question is, when should the president come in? First of all, if you do not have a structure, then the president becomes overused, and if you overuse the president, you devalue the president. So the president needs to be kind of preserved to just come in when you need him or her. And that requires a setup. So that's kind of one. Now, what can the president do in this case when you need to invoke the president? I think you need to invoke the president when you look at kind of high-value enterprises to change the behavior of who you're dealing with. So, a president who is not invoked too much can still have more impact in terms of Israeli domestic narrative. I mean, when we saw Clinton, for example, play this in a very smart way, other presidents did not play it as smartly. So how do you build up credit so that when you need it, you can impact Israeli domestic politics, which has changed from the 90s, but nevertheless, you can still impact it. Similarly, you would require, let's say about how do you impact the behavior of Hamas. To really impact the behavior of Hamas, you need to have the actually three main actors that Hamas listens to, do some fundamental policy changes. And here we're talking about Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar. Now, the Egyptian president or the Qatari emir, I don't know about Erdogan, but I suspect he's the same, will not take what the Secretary of State says terribly seriously. It's very different when it comes from the president backed with a kind of threat. But again, this doesn't happen if you drag the president into all of this. Overusing the president is useless, but also at the same time, you have to kind of position the president to do that, again, to impact these very substantial moments. And I think in these cases, the president can make a difference. If the president goes to the Qataris and say, really pressure Hamas, or your major non-NATO ally status might be in question, they will actually listen to that.
So, I'm going to follow up just with a question that we got from William Rue, who was the U.S. ambassador in the Gulf and an old friend of mine, but also a very established person in the foreign policy community working on the Middle East. And he was asking whether you think that the U.S. might restrict arms to Israel as a tool to get to move towards a ceasefire. I mean, that's sort of the major tool, right, that the U.S. has, right, holding back arms. Do you think that's in the works or possible?
Well, The Guardian just had an article today calling for that.
Oh.
Just today. Yeah, and there seems to be a lot of calls for that. And as I said, if you do surveys, it seems the majority of Americans in swing states favor that too, conditioning arms to Israel. I will be very cautious here in answering either way. I'll be very cautious to think that it will happen.
But I mean, do we think the Senate would ever sign off on that?
There's the politics side of it, which is, despite what opinion polls say, the Washington politics is going to be extremely difficult. I mean, a president wants to do something, they can do it usually if they're willing to pay the political price and put the kind of political capital into it. But it will be a lot of political capital. But if you look at it even from a strategic point of view, put the political, I think if you look at the U.S.-Israel relationship purely as a Gaza war issue, that one can talk about this. But if you look at it in a wider scope, in terms of some of the other interests that the two countries have in common, and frankly, this alliance benefits the U.S., whether in terms of regional stability, whether in terms of countering Iran, whether in terms of intelligence, etc. If you again widen the view, and again, the U.S.-Israel relationship is not only seen through the Palestinian-Israeli conflict prism, but there are many other components. Then there's also a strategic question on whether this is good for U.S. national security interest. More likely than that, you'll start seeing probably what we saw earlier with restricting certain kinds of armament for specific reason, or slow rolling or something like this. But to go all the way, this is something that goes beyond this particular conflict, besides the fact that, as you know, the political implications of it.
Got it, absolutely. Yes, please. Oh.
Hi, my name is Gabriella Fine. I'm a senior. I'm studying journalism. I'm curious if there's any concern about further isolating Iran to the end that they strengthen bonds with Russia and China to undermine the U.S. on the global political and economic stage.
I'm sorry, would you repeat again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's concern about further isolating Iran so that they would strengthen bonds with Russia and China to undermine the U.S. globally, politically and economically.
You mean that the U.S. isolate Iran more further, or Iran is like isolated? I'm sorry, is like
if Iran would strengthen their relationships with Russia and China as a result of the U.S. Further isolating Iran.
So right now, it seems that that the sanction, impact of sanction is for the first 2 years of sanctions, but it's like it has a long-term impact. But it seems that Iran recover its economy from the pressure of shock sanctions, like and the COVID as well. But Iran has to work. It's like over the last 2-3 years, the growth rate was 4 or 5%. It's very high. I talk about the long-term growth, but it's not sustainable. So it's like Iran cannot solve its issue without sanctions. So Iran has to work with the United States and West to solve the issue of sanction. Although in the short term, Iran could work with China and Russia to manage part of its needs, but economy needs to have has a lot of resources, diverse, and so it's like the sanction limit the power of Iran's economy, and as mentioned, is 1% over the last 15-16 years, but need to solve it. Is that right now is not very good in terms of again solving its problem, but it's not sustainable. It needs to, if we want to decrease its inflation, decrease the poverty, change the situation, Iran has to solve the issue of the sanction. But as a last sentence, the overusing sanction, U.S. sanction, someone argued that it can make a problem for domination of dollar in the long term, not in the short term. Like China, Russia, Iran, and even some other country think about this. So what should we do if we have any problem with the United States in the future? So we may think about the alternative path. So it's not for today or tomorrow. It's a long-term impact of sanctions. I hope to answer to your question.
I'm Nader Habibi with the Crown Center. Thank you, all of you. My question is for Nihal. I was wondering if you can comment about the prospects for normalization of relations between Turkey and Syria, given that we have observed a number of signals from Erdogan, and Turkey has normalized even with Egypt after all the exchanges. And also, if that happens, do you believe that a large number of Syrian refugees will go back to Syria? A portion of them have been so assimilated and Turkified that they might remain in Turkey.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, recently the Turkish president, Erdogan, has been floating the idea that he's going to normalize with Assad, has floated that he would meet with Assad. You know, I can't speak to how credible this is that they would normalize, but I can still kind of think about the hypothetical. If there was to be normalization, what would that mean for Syrian refugees? And I think if it were up to the Syrian refugees, they're going to stay in Turkey. You know, they've been there for now, a lot of them, over 10 years. Their kids speak better Turkish than Arabic. They are, to the extent that they could, under this kind of legal regime, are integrating somewhat. And I think if you told them that, you know, you're going to send them back to Syria, a lot of them first would argue correctly that Syria is not safe for them. A lot of these people were outspoken oppositionists, or, you know, were participating in the protests. And so they certainly wouldn't feel safe. And also, if there was to be some kind of intermediary solution where people are being deported to northern Syria, where Turkey exerts some political control, those areas are not safe either, and they also don't have the infrastructure to support millions, let alone thousands of Syrians. And this is the idea that Erdogan has been floating for years now, that he's going to create a safe zone in northern Syria that is a great solution for Syrian refugees who want to go back anyway. And these are all kind of fictions that Turkey wants to believe in to kind of keep that fantasy alive, I suppose, that the Syrians would eventually leave. But no, I don't think they're going to leave.
Hi, my name is Eva Schall. I'm not sure if this is entirely a question. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this. A lot of American protesters who are ostensibly pro-Palestine have been very critical and hostile of the Harris, formerly Biden, now Harris campaign. And they're like very like against the idea of her becoming president and make all sorts of accusations such as supporting genocide and such. And they don't seem to direct that same vitriol towards Trump, despite him being a lot more openly, at least in my view, hostile to Palestine and Palestinians. So any thoughts on how that political niche is unfolding?
Who's going to take the limelight? Okay, so I can try. So first of all, I'm not going to use the labels pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, because I oppose them, because I'm not sure that they actually accurately describe who is pro-Palestine or pro-Israel in their actions here in the United States, especially. So the thing is, Trump, I think, was kind of overridden or kind of escaped that by being discarded, you know, kind of ultimately. With Harris, I think, again, I'm speculating here, the assumption was that there is a leeway. If they push, there will be able to be a movement there. So there was I think that's the way I understand why it was more towards Harris rather than towards Trump. So because Trump have a very open an alliance with evangelical Christians, so you expect less from him. With Harris, you kind of expect more, you would say. So we'd say, okay, we will direct our attentions there. And I think because most of those who push Harris are Democrats. A lot of people would be identified as Democrats, those who demonstrate in the so-called pro-Palestine demonstrations. So I think this is the reason you have this kind of dichotomy. I don't think it's for the love of Trump that they don't do that, and so I know this uncommitted movement is very strong, and you see it also in surveys in the swing state, and that could be quite important in these elections because, for example, I just read the numbers in Michigan. You really have about 160,000 Arabs that can vote, that are in the voting, registered voters. But if that could change the outcomes. So it is a significant issue.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Rowan Hepler. I'm a freshman here. I wanted to ask about something that was briefly touched on during the presidential debate earlier this week. Do you think that Trump inviting the Taliban to the Camp David Accords emboldened terror groups in the years since then?
Gary, do you want to address that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't really think so. I mean, I think it's unconnected. Oh, I don't really think so. I think the calculation of terrorist groups depends upon their particular issue that they're trying to promote and the tactical opportunities they have. So I think it's hard to say that Trump doing a deal with the Taliban encouraged other terrorist groups. They have enough motivation without any encouragement from the U.S.
In like attacks, but in like trying to like put themselves in like international relations as like groups that have the right to like lead different countries or territories. Like, do you think that it emboldened them not necessarily like militarily but politically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be very hard to measure that. The Taliban is, of course, not an international terrorist group in the way that we think of ISIS or al-Qaeda. I mean, the Taliban were fighting for the liberation of their country from what they saw as American occupation. Like Hamas is fighting for the liberation of Palestine from what they see as Israeli occupation. So those kinds of groups are really quite different, I think, than international terrorist groups like ISIS or al-Qaeda.
So that said, I mean, and I fully agree, not all groups are cut from the same cloth, but for some of these groups, international legitimacy is actually quite important. I mean, I look at Hamas. I mean, I can't comment about the Taliban. I know nothing about that. But I look at Hamas. I would say they have been trying really since the 1990s to basically show that they are acceptable internationally. They would meet with a bunch of American students coming to Gaza, and they would publicize that because they want to present, in their internal competition with the others, with the PLO, etc. They want to say that, we are as kosher as they are. We don't use kosher, but the idea is because that's one of the grounds that you compete on. So one has to be very careful on how to engage with some of these terror groups and not to give them a win by this. And that's why, by the way, you see, for example, in the region, look who's dealing with, the Egyptians, for example, they always deal with Hamas through intelligence channels, not through the foreign ministry. The same with us, the same with most European countries. Those countries that support Hamas, like Qatar and like Turkey, deal with them on the political level. So this is definitely, yes, for the ISIS of the world, that's not the case, but for some of these organizations that want to replace and want to be players in the international scene, these kind of things, symbolism really, really matters.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
And also historically, if you look at in many cases, those who have been defined as terrorists become legitimate political actors, the Sinn Féin, PLO. So we have a lot of examples of terrorist group becoming legitimate political actors. I think the trick is to know when is this transition and then to legitimize that.
But also, what's the price? Because, I mean, in a lot of these cases, you had a lot of the idea of recognizing and mainstreaming them was held as the ultimate prize and was as such part of the pressure approach. You don't do it early on. And this way you lose a pressure, and, a carrot and a stick at the same time.
That's true, yeah. Yes?
Hi, my name is Leo. I'm a first-year student here at Brandeis. And I want to ask, assuming the war in Gaza ends in the near future, do you believe that would trigger new elections in Israel? And if so, do you think Netanyahu would stay in power?
That's yours.
Okay, so there is an attempt to expedite the Israeli election by the demonstrations in Israel. So far, it hasn't been successful. According to, again, recent polls, all the candidates that are on the map get about 30%, including Netanyahu, including Gantz. So it's about the same. They all get the same according to the most recent polls. At the moment, the coalition haven't identified anyone that will defect. So if no one defects, election will be done when they're supposed to happen. But so it's hard to say. Again, I'm just drawing on polls here. The most likely candidate to win is actually Naftali Bennett at the moment at the polls in Israel. So not Netanyahu, but Bennett. But I think it's really hard. I wouldn't rely on these polls right now because first, the war is ongoing. We don't know what the elections are. A lot can happen from now until then. If we have a regional war, that changes though. That's really likely to reshuffle a little bit Israeli domestic politics as well. So I will hesitate to make any prediction at the moment about when the election will happen or what will be their outcome.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Not a lot, most of it not very happy, but at least we're better informed. I just do want to say again that we are going to have an event. The Crown Center is hosting an event on Tuesday, October 8th, which is called the Israel-Hamas War, 1 year in. We'll be talking about the causes, conduct, and consequences of the war. So if that is something you want to get more informed about, we have some really superb scholars who can guide us through that. And with that, I'll say thank you for coming and see you soon.
Please help yourself to food as you leave. The conversation was depressing, but the food's good.